When we talk about writing, we often focus on the ideas, the characters, the plot, and sometimes the world if we're talking about fantasy or science fiction. One of the unsung heroes of fiction writing is setting. It's crucial to get right, whether you're writing a modern-day thriller, secondary world fantasy, romance, hard-boiled mystery, or a far future science fiction novel. There are plenty of ways to go wrong with setting, but mostly they revolve around telling too much, in which case it gets in the way of the story, or telling too little, in which case the action can feel vague or worse, confusing. You might run into talking head syndrome where the characters feel like they're just talking in a vacuum. Setting has to pull its own weight. There are important things it should do beyond describing the physical location where the scene takes place. It can and should be tied to the tone of the story, the emotions of the characters, the state and history of the world, and so much more. We're going to talk about all of that today, and we're going to be doing it by analyzing 3 different books. The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien, The Heroes by Joe Abercrombie, a fantasy novel, and Dark Matter by Blake Crouch, a mind-twisting sci-fi thriller sort of story. My hope is that by the end of this, you'll have all you need to take your settings and your stories to the next level. So stick around. Hey, if you're new to the channel, I'm Brad Bollier, and I'm a full-time fantasy and science fiction author with a dozen novels, tons of short stories, and 20-plus years of experience in the field of writing. I started a novel approach to share hard-earned lessons about writing, editing, publishing, and the business of writing to hopefully shorten your journey to publication. If that sounds up your alley, be sure to subscribe, and if you find this video useful, I hope you'll like, share, and maybe even buy me a coffee on ko-fi.com. Link in the description below. Okay, let's dive in. So I like to cover what I'm going to cover in this presentation up front. So we'll talk about what setting is and isn't, how much setting is enough, and also how much is too much perhaps, where to add setting for maximum effect, keeping a scene alive through setting interaction between the characters and the world that you're describing, how setting blurs with description and action, revealing character through setting, also revealing the world through setting. Then to start wrapping things up, we'll cover choosing settings for maximum effect. So let's start with this, the purpose of setting. The primary purpose of setting is to ground the reader in time and place so they can envision the place where the characters are interacting with one another, or perhaps with the world. But the best settings go far beyond that. Settings should also reveal details of your world, beyond the scene that's being shown to the reader. It should reveal character. It should help create mood and tone. Setting gives the reader a sense of time and place in your world, which is a good thing, but too much setting can bog the narrative down by slowing or entirely stopping the action. Just keep in mind the goings-on, the characters talking, doing things with one another, is effectively stopped if you don't handle setting correctly. If the reader can't picture where the action is happening, then they'll have this vague sense of time and place, and you might run into something like talking head syndrome, where it just feels like heads are in a vacuum talking to each other. We have to strike a balance between these two extremes. As we'll see, the amount of description that you choose to show can vary wildly, and there is no right or wrong answer here. It just depends on your book and perhaps the particular scene that you're writing. So it can change from author to author, from project to project, from scene to scene. Only you can answer how much is enough. But we'll talk about some of the things to consider along the way. Choosing your setting details with care. The amount of page time that we have to dedicate to setting is limited, and it's impossible. You cannot describe everything. So instead of thinking about what to cut, I want you to think about what to include. What details are most important to the upcoming scene? What details will have the most impact on the reader and perhaps the characters? We'll be focusing on those 2 questions throughout the presentation, and we'll be doing that by using 3 case studies that I mentioned in the intro. The Heroes by Joe Abercrombie is a gritty fantasy about a band of aging mercenaries. The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien, the beloved story of Bilbo Baggins going on a grand adventure to the Lonely Mountain. And Dark Matter by Blake Crouch, a multiverse tale about a man trying to get back to his family after being abducted. And I'd like to start by looking at the 3 opening scenes, the opening pages from each of those books. So let's take a look. So here's the heroes from Joe Abercrombie. "Too old for this shit," muttered Craw, wincing at the pain in his dodgy knee with every other step. And by the way, if I'm moving a bit too fast, and just for your own knowledge, you can pause this. Hopefully I've made it large enough for you to be able to read this on your screen. And you can just look over the scene on your own, either to take in what you can before I talk about it, or to analyze it a bit after I've talked about certain things within the scenes. So I am going to jump around a little bit as we move forward, so just keep that in mind. So here, notice that we start with dialogue. It does not start with a setting. We don't know where we are at this point. We know that we're with Craw, whoever that is, and that he feels like he's too old for this shit, whatever this shit is. And he has a pain in his leg, a dodgy knee. So he goes on. High time he retired. Long past high time. Sat on the porch behind his house with a pipe, smiling at the water as the sun sank down, a day's honest work behind him. Not that he had a house, but when he got one, it'd be a good one. So first paragraph, zero setting from the current scene. He's just reminiscing. We have internal monologue, a bit of dialogue, a bit of description about his dodgy knee, the pain that he has there, which implies some things about him. That he's been through some things in life to give him a dodgy knee, for example. We move on. We get to some setting. He found his way through a gap in the tumble-down wall. We have no idea where this wall exists or where he's coming from. His heart banging like a joiner's mallet. From the long climb up the steep slope and the wild grass clutching at his boots and the bullying wind trying to bundle him over. But mostly, if he was honest, from the fear he'd end up getting killed at the top. He's going up a steep slope, so we assume he's going up an incline of some sort, perhaps a hill. So after that, more internal monologue. He'd never laid claim to being a brave man, and he'd only got more cowardly with age. Strange thing that, the fewer years you have to lose, the more you fear the losing of them. So he goes on like that, and then we get to this fourth paragraph on the second page here. He snatched a breather as he finally got to level ground, bent over, rubbing the wind-stung tears from his eyes, trying to muffle his coughing, which only made it louder. The heroes, the eponymous heroes, after which the book was named, is a henge. And so the heroes loomed from the dark ahead, great holes in the night sky where no stars shone. 4 times man height or more, forgotten giants marooned on their hilltop in the scouring wind, standing stubborn guard over nothing. Now we're getting a decent sense, we still don't know what wall he went through to go up this hill and get to this henge at the top, but we're starting to get a good sense of where he is, thanks in part to just how economical Abercrombie is with his setting and everything really, dialogue, exposition, internal monologue, etc. He really packs stuff into his words, which is one of the reasons he's such a good writer and so beloved by his fans. Take note of the next paragraph. Craw found himself wondering how much each of those great slabs of rock weighed. Only the dead knew how they'd dragged the bastard things up here, or who had, or why. The dead weren't telling, though, and Craw had no plans on joining him just to find out. So here, Abercrombie is using the setting as a way to go into internal monologue for Craw. So we're slipping from setting into internal monologue. And this is one of the things that I want you to get into your head early and to use this often in your own writing. Setting can be a sounding board for characters. As we go through the setting, as we describe the setting, we're doing it from a certain point of view. And so the character should be viewing that setting in a certain way, and Craw certainly is here, right? So we're going from physical setting into the mind of the POV character. And we're shedding light on who he is by using the setting. And so we're going to be doing that over and over again in these examples. And again, I just want you to keep that in mind as we move forward. We move on. He saw the faintest glow of firelight now, at the stone's rough edges, heard the chatter of men's voices over the wind's low growl. That brought back the risk he was taking, and a fresh wave of fear washed up with it. So here, we are going again from setting into internal monologue, but we're also implying plot at this point. So we're going from setting, the world, into character, his internal monologue, into plot. He's in danger by going to the top of this hill. We don't know why, but we do know that at least he fears that he's in danger. And we're starting to touch on another point, which is the trust that you start to build with a reader. The author is hinting that something is coming, that there is danger here. And so if we follow through on that later, we will have built a little bit of trust with the reader. And we want to keep doing that early on so that we can keep implying and pulling the reader along. and then delivering on those small promises that we make along the way. And then we close with, so he took a deep breath, trying to remember how he'd felt when he was young and had no dodgy joints and didn't care a shit for nothing, picked out a likely gap between two of those big old rocks and strolled through. So that's the opening. Really sparse in the beginning, and then we get more and more setting as things go along. So Abercrombie here did not dump setting. This is no setting dump. We're getting little bits and pieces, and we're playing back and forth between internal monologue, action, a little bit of plot as we open this story. Really good stuff. Okay, let's switch over to The Hobbit. And again, first page. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit, one of the best lines in writing. Not a nasty, dirty, wet hole filled with the ends of worms and an oozy smell, nor yet a dry, bare, sandy hole with nothing in it to sit down on or to eat. It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort. Second paragraph. We go into some deep description here, and notice this is all description. There's no dialogue. We don't know who this is about yet. We just know it will involve hobbits, and our camera in this story is starting out on a hobbit hole and going inside, basically. It, the hobbit hole, had a perfectly round door like a porthole, painted green with a shiny yellow brass knob in the exact middle. The door opened on a tube-shaped hall-like tunnel. We go on and on. We describe this hobbit hole. Tolkien is describing the place where Bilbo Baggins lives, who we'll meet in a little bit, but this starts to say things about the world, and we assume the character we're about to meet. So again, promises are being made by the author that he will follow up on very quickly. Keep in mind, this was published anyway, in 1937, and this was new at the time. People didn't know what hobbits were, and so Tolkien had to describe what hobbits were like at some point. He chose to describe their homes, which says a lot about the type of people who live in them, right? And so here, heavy description up front. And neither is right or wrong. It just depends on the story. Both of these were right for the types of story that were being written. Now let me go to Dark Matter. So here's page 1 of Dark Matter. I love Thursday nights. They have a feel to them that's outside of time. It's our tradition, just the three of us, family night. So right off the bat, we get a sense that the main character has a family, their husband, wife, son, or daughter, and it is currently family night. The first three paragraphs, don't have any setting per se. We kind of have a sense that we're in a modern world, Thursday nights, family night. That implies modern time. So we have a sense of time. We don't have a sense of place just yet. And that comes in paragraph 4. My son, Charlie, is sitting at the table drawing on a sketch pad. He's almost 15. The kid grew 2 inches over the summer, and he's as tall as I am now. So now we have a little bit of sense of Charlie, the home that they're in, and also the protagonist, because Charlie grew up a bit. He's now as tall as the main character, who is Jason Dessen, the father. I turn away from the onion I'm julienning, ask, can I see? He holds up the pad, shows me a mountain range that looks like something on another planet. I say, love that, just for fun? Class project, due tomorrow. Then get back to it, Mr. Last Minute. Standing happy and slightly drunk in my kitchen, I'm unaware that tonight is the end of all this. Boom. We have a huge precursor, foreshadowing of what's to come in this chapter. The end of everything I know, everything I love. Wow, that's a huge promise, right? We're talking about promises in the other 2 books, and in this one, another promise, and it's a big one. No one tells you it's all about to change, to be taken away. So that's what's going to happen at some point in the story. There's no proximity alert, no indication that you're standing on the precipice, and maybe that's what makes tragedy so tragic. Not just what happens, but how it happens. A sucker punch that comes at you out of nowhere when you're least expecting it. No time to flinch or brace. More setting. The track lights shine on the surface of my wine, and the onion is beginning to sting my eyes. Thelonious Monk spins on the old turntable in the den. There's a richness to the analog recording I can never get enough of, especially the crackle of static between tracks. The den is filled with stacks and stacks of rare vinyl that I keep telling myself I'll get around to organizing one of these days. Daniela, his wife, is sitting at the kitchen table, swirling her almost empty wine glass. And so we're getting a very good idea by this point. Even though we started out with internal thoughts from Jason, we get bits and pieces along the way. Again, there's no setting dump here, as there was necessarily in The Hobbit. Here, like Joe Abercrombie's book, the heroes were just getting bits and pieces, and it's filling in pretty quickly. And part of the reason that Blake Crouch can do this is because it's all familiar stuff. This is a modern tale, even though it's kind of science fictional and it's a multiverse story. We get to that eventually, but it starts out in the modern day world. And so all of this stuff feels familiar to us. We sort of get it. And so he can easily drop clues that fill in a ton of detail for the reader. So a bit of dialogue here, and then it closes up with, I walk over to her, take the phone gently out of her hand, and set it on the countertop. So those three openings showed some different approaches to setting, but the opening scenes are a bit special as compared to later scenes. The opening scene has to hook early, and so different approaches might be taken on your first scene than you might use later on. So let's take a look at some later scenes as well. I'm going to jump to the second scene of each of those books, and then we'll start pulling some lessons from these. So we'll start with Dark Matter, since we ended up there. And towards the bottom of the page on the left, Whole Foods smells like the hippie I dated before Daniela, a tincture of fresh produce, ground coffee, and essential oils. The scare with the cab has, and that's part of the previous scene, has flattened my buzz, and I browse the freezer cases in something of a fog, lethargic and sleepy. It feels colder when I'm back outside, a brisk wind blowing in off the lake, portending the shitty winter that looms right around the corner. With my canvas bag filled with ice cream, I take a different route towards home. It adds 6 blocks, but what I lose in brevity, I gain in solitude. And between the cab and Ryan, I need some extra time to reset. I pass a construction site, abandoned for the night, and then we move on through here. And next paragraph, there's an energy to these autumn nights that touches something primal inside of me. So again, Crouch is using setting to jump into the internal mindset of Jason Dessen. So one of the things that we can do, again, is to use setting as a leaping off point to talk about internal thoughts, their current mindset, maybe even replay things that had happened to them in the previous scene, perhaps make plans, their fears about what's coming up next, that type of thing. So he's heading home. He's taking this long walk. He says, it will be good to be home again. I'm thinking of starting up the gas logs at the house. We've never had a fire before Halloween, but tonight is so unseasonably cold that after walking a mile in this wind, all I want is to sit by the hearth with Daniela and Charlie and a glass of wine. So here in this short-ish paragraph, we're getting some setting of home, even though we're not there. He's thinking about it, and we're piecing together more and more of his home. We got some of it right up front. We're getting more of it now by his internal thoughts. We're not even seeing that place, but by him reminiscing or thinking about having a fire and how cold it is outside, it just pulls a bunch of stuff together. It's just really efficient writing and evocative as well at the same time. The street undercuts the L, it goes on. I pass beneath the rusting ironwork of the railway. For me, even more than the skyline, the L personifies the city of Chicago. This is my favorite section of the walk home because it's the darkest and quietest. At the moment, no trains inbound, no headlights in either direction, no audible pub noise. Nothing but the distant roar of a jet overhead on final approach into O'Hare. Wait, there's something coming. Footfalls on the sidewalk. I glance back. A shadow rushes towards me, the distance between us closing faster than I can process what's happening. The first thing I see is a face. So remember early on, he was talking about like things are going to change forever right at the beginning of the chapter. And then here we see, we don't know what's going on. We don't even know if this is fulfilling the promise that he made, but we certainly think it might be, right? And so we have this setting heavy section at this point. I would call it kind of light-ish in that first scene. In this scene, it's real heavy, but he's using it really effectively to paint the scene, paint his life, paint his home life a little bit, and then boom, something is coming at him. It's just a huge rush of energy right at the end there. You know, we are not stopping this book at this point. And it's partly because he handled the setting and using that to pull in other things like internal thoughts, fears, hopes into the story. Okay, so here we're back in The Hobbit, and in the first chapter, it was essentially Bilbo listening to the offer from Gandalf and the dwarves to go on this big adventure to the Lonely Mountain and to get the treasure of Smaug back for the dwarves. And so here in the second chapter, we start a new scene. So up jumped Bilbo and putting on his dressing gown, went into the dining room. There he saw nobody but all the signs of a large and hurried breakfast. There was a fearful mess in the room and piles of unwashed crocks in the kitchen. Nearly every pot and pan he possessed seemed to have been used. The washing up was so dismally real that Bilbo was forced to believe the party of the night before had not been part of his bad dreams, as he had rather hoped. And so here, setting is being used to recall events of the past, the previous night, the previous chapter. It all kind of comes rushing back. And so a bunch of that stuff comes back into our head as we're reading, but it also gives light to Bilbo's mindset. He wanted this to be a dream. He doesn't really want to go off on a big grand adventure, even though he was kind of excited about it the night before and was built up to that moment and agreed. Now he's kind of regretting that. And so setting is used as a way to portray that mindset of Bilbo's. So we go down a bit further. Don't be a fool, Bilbo Baggins. He puts on an apron, lit fires, boiled water, and washed up. He had a nice little breakfast, and then Gandalf shows up. "My dear fellow," said he, "whenever are you going to come? What about an early start? And here you are having breakfast, or whatever you call it, at 10:30. They left you the message because they could not wait." "What message?" Bilbo asks. "Great elephants, you are not at all yourself this morning. Have you never dusted the mantelpiece?" And so he goes to the mantelpiece and he finds the note written by the dwarves that they've gone off ahead to kind of get ready and they expect Bilbo to join them. Here, we're still pretty setting heavy in the second scene, but note that Tolkien didn't have to describe things very much, even though in the beginning he did. And that's because we were unfamiliar with what a hobbit hole was like in the first chapter. But we got a very good sense of it throughout that first chapter. It was a fairly long chapter. And here, we just don't have to cover all that stuff again. So keep that in mind as well. Once you've set up a setting, as long as it comes again fairly quickly, you don't have to re-describe everything. You can assume that the reader will remember some of that stuff, right? And just give hints of it, and they'll fill in the rest. Their mind will just recall those things, and the stage in their mind's eye, the theater of the mind, will fill in very quickly with just giving little hints here and there. And so he does talk about the making a breakfast and the pots and pans and the cleaning up, that sort of thing. And then you recall the dinner and the getting of the plates and the getting of the food from the larder, that sort of thing. All that stuff comes rushing back. So you can rely on that the reader will recall those clues and fill in those details, so you don't have to describe quite as much. So in the heroes, we are jumping forward a couple of chapters. It's a multi-POV book. There are quite a few characters who get to be POV characters, and one of them is this character, Bremer Dan Gorst, who is referred to as Gorst in the book. So it starts with a letter, and then it opens with, "The column was in chaos." So we assume whoever this is about, and we see right at the bottom of the letter, it's addressed to Bremer Dan Gorst. So we kind of assume it's him. "The column was in chaos. The rain poured down. The army was mired in the filth, and the men were in the most rotten spirits, and mine the most rotten in the whole putrefying swarm." So we get a bit of setting. We don't know where we are exactly, but we're in a rainstorm. We're in an army. People are miserable, and the main character is in a bad mood. We don't know if he's normally in a bad mood, but he is certainly in a bad mood right now. So again, setting is leading us to internal monologue. Bremer Dan Gorst forced his way through a mud-spattered crush of soldiers, all wriggling like maggots. And just by the description, the words that Abercrombie is choosing, he's already called them a swarm, a putrefying swarm. Now the soldiers are wriggling like maggots. We are getting a very good idea of what Gorst is like, at least his current mindset, but we're already getting the sense that he's kind of a rotten guy a lot of times. Okay, so wriggling like maggots, their armor running with wet, their shouldered pikes poking lethally in all directions. They were stopped as solid as milk turned rank in a bottle, but men still squelched up from behind, adding their own burdens of ill temper to the jostling mass, choking the thread of muck that passed for a road, and forcing men cursing into the trees. He's following up on his promise that this was a rotten time, a miserable place to be, by the words he's choosing. They were stopped as solid as milk turned rank in a bottle. They were squelching up from behind, adding their own burdens of ill temper to the jostling mass. Everybody's in a bad mood. He's just piling on more and more details, sort of setting, but sort of internal monologue and like mood, like Gorst's assessment of the mood of this army. And he's probably not wrong. Gorst was already late and had to assert himself as the press titan, brushing men aside. Sometimes they would turn to argue as they stumbled in the slop, but they soon shut their mouths when they saw who he was. They knew him. The adversary that had so confounded His Majesty's army proved to be one of its own wagons, slid from the ankle-deep mud of the track and into the considerably deeper bog beside. So he goes on to describe this wagon and that he's about to try to help get unmired. 3 young officers stood nearby, the shoulders of their scarlet uniforms turned soggy maroon in the downpour. Next paragraph, the enemy could scarcely have arranged a more effective blockage with 1,000 picked men. What is this? Gorst demanded, fighting, and of course failing to sound authoritative. So here, unlike Abercrombie's opening in that first chapter, very, very setting heavy, but at the same time, you just get a really good sense of what it's like to be there. So it is drawing you into this really horrible time in Gorst's life. He is really drawing you in and making it visceral, this scene that Gorst is in, this situation that he finds himself in this army as they're marching somewhere. We don't know where yet. Okay, so having looked at those, what lessons can we learn? First of all, descriptions of setting can vary wildly. We can see that from really sparse to very heavily detailed. There's no one type of setting that's going to work for all books or even all scenes. You'll change as you move along throughout your story. Tolkien focused just on the things that mattered at the moment to Bilbo and the coming journey. Settings should provide enough detail to orient the reader, but no more than that. And this is true of any part of fiction, including dialogue and exposition, internal monologue. But in this case, we're trying to describe the world. So go no farther than you have to. And that kind of implies that you're choosing the things that will have the most impact. So if the setting itself is interesting and important, it may be worthwhile to explore in some detail, like we saw in that first chapter of The Hobbit. Also keep in mind that The Hobbit required some special description of Bilbo's home because that was new to the reader in 1937, while The Heroes and Dark Matter did not. They kind of relied on standard fantasy tropes in the case of The Heroes and modern life and the modern world in the case of Dark Matter. The setting itself should be in keeping with the overall tone of the story, or if you're writing a multi-POV story, the tone of that particular character and their thread. And of course, the tone can change a little bit as the character themselves change as the story progresses. The setting should also be rooted in the personality of the POV character. We see the descriptions change quite a bit in Abercrombie's novel, The Heroes. And that's because all the characters are different. He's really masterful at that kind of thing, changing things up based on the current mindset and general personality of the POV character. Bilbo, Craw, and Jason Dessen, for example, are very different characters, and those differences should carry over to the setting descriptions, even though I guess at first glance, when you first come to writing, you might think, well, setting is just setting, but that's not true. You're not just describing the world. You are using it for many other purposes besides that. And again, in a multi-POV book, the description should change with the character. The setting is also integrally linked to the world. What you choose to show as the author gives the reader subtle hints as to what the world is like and also what's important in the story. This implies that choosing your setting, choosing where to place your scenes, should be done with care, and we're going to come back to that later. So we don't just add setting up front, we also add it mid-scene. We need to keep the scene alive as it progresses, and we do that by adding bits of setting during the scene itself. And the best way to do that, generally speaking, is to have the characters interact with it in some way. So let's look at some examples of those. So let me just continue with Joe Abercrombie's The Heroes. We introduced Gorst, and he got to the front of this line in the stuck wagon. And just a little bit later here we see, "Go," he squeaked at the driver, for once forgetting even to try to lower his voice. And this, by the way, starts to imply that Gorst is sort of a political animal, and he's worried about what other people think of him, and that's reinforced from other parts that we've already read. But then we go, "Whip snapped. Men groaned, horses snorted, mud sucked." Gorst strained from his toes to his scalp, every muscle locked and vibrating with effort. The world faded, and he was left alone with his task. He grunted, then growled, then hissed, the rage boiling up in him as if he had a bottomless tank of it instead of a heart, and he only had to turn the tap to rip this wagon apart. So we have the the whip snapped sound. We have men groaned, more sound. We have horses snorted, again. Mud sucked. We have the feel of the mud churning beneath their feet as they're trying to push this thing. But then we get this good sense of what is going on with Gorst, this description of him straining to get this wagon out of the muck, right? We also see just how angry this person and miserable I think Gorst is in general. Because yes, he's having to deal with an unfortunate situation, but man, is he angry about it. Holy cow. And we also see that he projects something different, right, on the outside, and he bottles things up. We move on. The wheels gave with a protesting shriek, lurched from the bog and forward. Suddenly straining at nothing, Gorst stumbled despairingly, then flopped face down in the mire, one of the soldiers falling beside him. He struggled up as the wagon rattled away, the driver fighting to bring his plunging horses under control. I will touch on this again, but note that we're getting lots of feels and sounds along with it. So we're trying to incorporate multiple senses every time we describe a scene. Generally speaking, 3 of the 5 senses is the rule of thumb. You can, of course, use more, and I'll cover that a bit later. Thanks for the help, sir. The mudcake soldier reached out with a clumsy paw and managed to smear the muck that now befouled Gorst's uniform even more widely. Sorry, sir. Very sorry. So here, a mudcake soldier, it just reminds us of the mud that they're in. It sort of refreshes the setting for us a little bit. Accidentally smearing the mud on Gorst's uniform reminds us that there's just mud all around, and also that the men who are just pushing this wagon out are just covered in mud, at least up to their, like shins, that kind of thing. But the guys who fell down are just now covered in it. So that small interaction does a ton of work. It's super efficient. Keep your axles oiled, you retarded scum. Keep your cart on the road, you gawping halfwits. Do your damn jobs, you lazy vermin. Again, vermin, maggots, swarm from the previous descriptions. Good, muttered Gorst. So all this stuff is going on in his head. This just like furious thoughts, right? And then he says good to the guy who just smeared mud all over his uniform. So he brushes the man's hand away and making a futile attempt to straighten his jacket. Thank you. So good and thank you when he's thinking all these things, right? He stalked off into the drizzle after the wagon and could almost hear the mocking laughter of the men and their officers prickling at his back. Again, it's just super vivid. Almost hear the mocking laughter of the men. So that paints Gorst a certain way. He's worried about what other people think of him, right? But then also, what is he hearing in his mind? The laughter of the men? That refreshes the idea of the men and their officers prickling at his back. We know where they are. Again, just a really concise and vivid way of describing this pretty terrible situation that Gorst finds himself in, while also shedding light very clearly on the type of man Gorst is. Okay, let's go back to Dark Matter. Continuing on from this one as well. So we find this man running at Jason in the dark. First thing he sees is a face. We jump forward just a little bit. So this guy we see has a gun, and he tells Jason to turn around, start walking. What I'm trying to focus on here is this orange bit on the left side now. So the abductor tells Jason to turn around and walk. He does. And now we're seeing things from Jason's point of view. A train roars past overhead, and we emerge from the darkness under the L, my heart rocketing inside my chest. I absorb my surroundings with a sudden and profound curiosity. Across the street is a gated townhome complex, and this side of the block comprises a collection of businesses that shutter at 5. A nail salon, a law office, an appliance repair shop, a tire store. This neighborhood is a ghost town, nobody out. See that SUV? We're getting a bit of setting in dialogue. See that SUV? His abductor asks. There's a black Lincoln Navigator parked on the curb just ahead. The alarm chirps. Get in the driver's seat. And so here we get a sense of Jason becoming more and more desperate. He is looking at the setting and hoping to find somebody that can help him. He's looking at these businesses and really hoping that somebody is there he can yell out to, or that sees him and calls the cops, that kind of thing. The nail salon, the law office, etc., etc. And so simply by describing the setting, here Blake Crouch is using it very effectively to enhance the sense that we're getting from Jason that he is not only desperate, but becoming more so with every single paragraph. Super efficient stuff and really impactful, right? Really gripping. And then in The Hobbit, so we have Bilbo realizing he has to go on this grand adventure. Gandalf tells him about the note. He reads the note, and then he's running off to meet the dwarves. So we get to this part here in orange. So no time for that either. Off you go, Gandalf says. To the end of his days, Bilbo could never remember how he found himself outside without a hat, a walking stick, or any money or anything that he usually took when he went out, leaving his second breakfast half finished and quite unwashed up, pushing his keys into Gandalf's hands and running as fast as his furry feet could carry him down the lane, past the great mill, across the water, and then on for a mile or more. And so here Tolkien is using setting to imply the pace at which things are moving right now. They're moving very quickly. He kind of rattles through the things he would normally do on a morning like this and the things that he would normally go out with when he leaves his home. And then we're rushing past, down the lane, past the Great Mill, across the water, and then on for a mile or more. So setting is kind of playing proxy to passage of time in a way, but also the hurried feeling that Bilbo has. Moving on, very puffed he was when he got to Bywater just on the stroke of 11 and found he had come without a pocket handkerchief. Bravo, said Balin, who was standing at the inn door looking out for him. Just then, all the others came round the corner of the road from the village. They were on ponies, and each pony was slung about with all kinds of baggages, packages, parcels, and paraphernalia. There was a very small pony, apparently, for Bilbo. So that gets us to the dwarves. They have a bit of dialogue here about moving on, getting on with their journey, that sort of thing. And we come to the bottom of the page. That's how they all came to start, jogging off from the inn one fine morning just before May on laden ponies. And Bilbo was wearing a dark green hood, a little weather-stained, and a dark green cloak borrowed from Dwalin. They were too large for him, and he looked rather comic. What his father Bungo would have thought of him, I daren't think. His only comfort was he couldn't be mistaken for a dwarf, as he had no beard. So here, almost by necessity, Tolkien is refreshing the setting because Bilbo is moving through it. And that's one of the ways that you'll want to use setting, is to keep the current place in mind for the reader. And if that place is changing, you want to show that to the reader. And in this case, we see it through a rapid run from his home through Hobbiton to meet the dwarves, and then them setting off from the inn to begin their journey towards the Lonely Mountain. So we mentioned this notion of keeping the scene alive after you've described it, however much you describe it in the beginning. As the scene moves along, you have to refresh it, explain more. The reason we do this is because the reader's conception of the scene begins to fade after you've described it. Like a flash of light followed by darkness. You see an after image, but that only lasts for so long, it starts to fade. And it fades relatively quickly. So it's imperative to refresh the scene by having the characters interact with the setting, noticing things about their surroundings, commenting on it through dialogue perhaps. And that brings up this notion of static versus dynamic setting description. Setting description can be static or dynamic. The static description has no character involvement, and we saw that in that first chapter of The Hobbit where we're describing the Hobbit hole. Dynamic description is description through character action, which we saw a lot more of in the Dark Matter excerpt, that first chapter, and The Heroes from Joe Abercrombie. If you make it static, the action of the scene is sort of put on pause, and that's dangerous. It's distancing and can be dull for the reader. You have to handle that stuff with care. And that's why mid-scene settings lean heavily towards dynamic. So some examples. Bilbo pushing his keys into Gandalf's hands and rushing through Hobbiton. Jason Desson emerging from the darkness under the L and absorbing his surroundings, hoping to see someone, hoping for help. Gorst helping to get that wagon unstuck in the rain. Very dynamic. Is there a place for static description? Yes. I mean, The Hobbit is an adventure story, but it's also a travelogue. And the description of the places that they pass convey movement. Now, that is an older style of story, and so I'm not suggesting that you write that kind of story. I'm not saying you shouldn't either, but I'm saying there are risks with that kind of thing. I happen to love The Hobbit, and so I like that Tolkien does describe the world because it's another place for me to visit and experience. And he's also, I think, really good about pulling in like the past and the history of Middle-earth, the myth and the legend of that place through his descriptions. And that's part of my enjoyment of it. In other words, he's doing more than just describing the place. And that's just something I want you to keep in mind over and over and over as you plan for your scene, as you write the scene and as you edit the scene later on, getting ready for publication. Let's take a quick look at that type of passage here. So Bilbo and company are off on their journey. They've just begun. On the previous page, we saw that Bilbo caught up with them, and now they're going on their journey. And so in this pink part here, at first they had passed through Hobbit lands, a wide, respectable country inhabited by decent folk, with good roads, an inn or two, and now and then a dwarf or farmer ambling by on business. Then they came to lands where people spoke strangely and sang songs Bilbo had never heard before. Now they had gone on far into the lone lands, where there were no people left, no inns, and the roads grew steadily worse. Not far ahead were dreary hills, rising higher and higher, dark with trees. On some of them were old castles with an evil look, as if they had been built by wicked people. Everything seemed gloomy, for the weather that day had taken a nasty turn. Mostly it had been as good as May can be even in merry tales, but now it was cold and wet. In the lone lands they had been obliged to camp when they could, but at least it had been dry. To think it will soon be June, grumbled Bilbo, as he splashed along behind the others in a very muddy track. Here again, this is a travelogue type story. They're going on a long journey, and you have to describe it. Setting is, in part here, just like Bilbo's run from his house to meet the dwarves, it is indicating a passage of time. And so we're not just getting setting, we are also getting a sense of the passage of days as they move through their journey into the more dangerous parts eventually. Another common place for static description are set pieces. What are set pieces? Those are big moments in a story that you are hinting at and then deliver at some point. In the case of Dark Matter, we eventually find out that Jason is abducted by a version of himself. And that version of himself was a scientist who created a method of moving between alternate realities. And so he goes from his reality to Jason's. So Jason 2 comes to Jason 1's world and abducts him because he wants to change places. He wants a different life. And this is very much a story about what if, a life led differently. What could I have done differently if I had to do it all over again? And so when we actually see the technology and the device that Jason created, it's been built up in our minds and hinted at for quite a while. And so spending time on that makes perfect sense, right? That's very interesting to the reader at that point because they want to know more about it. We've teased them along the way to make them want it. Similarly, in The Hobbit, we hint at Smaug, this dragon that stole the Lonely Mountain, in essence, from the dwarves and has this huge hoard of gold and such inside of it. And he's hinted at it over and over and over again. And so when we finally get to the Lonely Mountain and Bilbo sneaks down this corridor or this secret passage to the hoard and Smaug himself, Tolkien takes a little bit of extra time. Let's take a look at that. So here we see, there he lay, a vast red gold dragon fast asleep. A thrumming came from his jaws and nostrils, and wisps of smoke, but his fires were low in slumber. Beneath him, under all his limbs and his huge coiled tail, and about him on all sides, stretching away across the unseen floors, lay countless piles of precious things, gold wrought and unwrought, gems and jewels, and silver red-stained in the ruddy light. Just love this passage. Smaug lay with wings folded like an immeasurable bat, turned partly on one side so that the hobbit could see his underparts and his long pale belly crusted with gems and fragments of gold from his long lying on his costly bed. You can read the rest of this, but this is a set piece. We have hinted at Smaug over and over again, and here we finally get to meet him. And it's a moment to take time and just relish in this because the reader wants it at this point. And so you should make Smaug impressive, or the thing impressive, or gross, or scary, or sexy, or what have you. Whatever you're trying to do in your story, the thing that you've been hinting at a ton until you get to it finally and describe it, you should really lean into it. That's part of what a set piece is about. Tolkien certainly does that here, and this is one of the greatest chapters in the book because we've been waiting to see what Smaug is like, and then they have this interesting interaction between Bilbo and the thief going into Smaug's lair and Smaug himself. So just a really great way to kind of set that up, that scene, by showing him in some detail. So set pieces, used sparingly, it can be very powerful in your story. Save it for elements that are important and that you hint at along the way, that the reader really wants to see and experience when you get to it. the question comes up, where should we add setting? Setting is generally added to the narrative for these primary reasons: to set the stage initially, to keep the setting fresh. We've talked about both of those. A flash from the strobe light, in other words, we'll keep doing that as the scene moves along. To describe changes to the setting as the scene progresses. So, in other words, not going to a new place entirely and describing that, but rather something is changing within the scene itself. So if the storm broke in Gorst's world and we see sunshine, that could be an example of the setting itself changing around them and the character taking note of it. And you, the author, perhaps using that as a way to introduce something else or have the characters think internally about something. And then finally, as we saw, to describe new settings as the characters move through the world. Bilbo rushing from his home through Hobbiton to meet the dwarves at the inn. So let me return to Dark Matter and show you something interesting. So Jason is being forced to drive away by his abductor. And so at this pink section in the bottom right, we see, Jason, just so we're clear, if you do anything other than follow these directions to the letter, I'm going to shoot you through the seat. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Yes. I drive us through my neighborhood, wondering if I'm seeing it all for the last time. At a red light, I pull to a stop in front of my corner bar. Through the deeply tinted front passenger window, I see the door is still propped open. He was there earlier. I glimpse Matt, and through the crowd, Ryan, turned around in his stool now, his back to the bar, his elbows on the scuffed wood, holding court for his post-grads, probably enthralling them with a horrifying cautionary tale of failure starring his old roommate, Jason. I want to call out to him, to make him understand that I'm in trouble, that I need... Green light, Jason. I accelerate through the intersection. The GPS navigation guides us east through Logan Square to the Kennedy Expressway, where the indifferent female voice instructs me, turn right in 100 feet and proceed for 19.8 miles. Southbound traffic is light enough for me to peg the speedometer at 70 and keep it there. My hands sweat on the leather steering wheel, and I can't stop wondering, am I going to die tonight? In the previous excerpt that I showed you, he was looking at the different buildings, wondering if he could find some help. Now he's kind of settling into the notion that he is in deep, deep trouble and he doesn't have much hope left. And as he is driving, the distance from home, which represents safety for him, is becoming greater, right? He's moving away from it. And that is playing proxy to his horror as he's being led away to do who knows what. He doesn't know what's going to happen. He doesn't know why he's being abducted or by who. So he thinks he might die. And so the point here is we're using setting and we're describing things very well, but in a very spare way because he's very scared at this point, right? And all he's concerned about is that he's going away from the place that he feels safe and safety in general, right? Setting, again, is being used to show emotional. It's being tied to emotion in a very direct way. So when Jason is abducted, he's forced to drive through Chicago. The setting outside the car gives a sense of movement, but it conveys Jason's horror at what's happening to him as well. The greater the distance from his home, the greater his horror. The setting, in other words, is playing proxy to his emotions. So we want to use setting to give us a window somehow into the character's emotions. And so this brings up this notion of world, character, plot interaction. I've used this in my other presentations as well, and I'm bringing it back here because setting is so closely tied to world. It is not the world itself, it's just a part of the world. So it does give us a window to the world. It kind of represents that or is tied to it very closely, but we want to use the setting to tie it to both character and plot, and give greater light to the world itself, the world at large. We want to hint at things and let the reader expand on that within their own mind based on the clues that you've given them. Also keep in mind, as you're working through your story, you're going to be going through an internal and external arc. I talk about this a lot more in my plotting video. You can look at that for more info. But we have this notion of the world giving rise to the character, and the character has internal desires. And the world also can give rise to, has the prerequisites for a certain type of plot, these external events that are happening, people working against perhaps the main character in some way. So that's the internal arc and the external arc. So the character's internal arc is shown through their desires and what they're trying to do, their internal monologue and their actions, their words, versus the external events, which is the external arc. And as the story moves along, those two constantly play against one another and complicate one another as we move closer and closer to the resolution, where both internal arc and external arc are resolved, usually in one fell swoop. So let's touch on setting as a doorway to character first. We'll talk about world next. I'm going to show you Jason being led into an abandoned building, Bilbo sneaking up on trolls, the famous troll scene in the woods, and then Calder, one of the characters in Abercrombie's The Heroes, his description of a war meeting. So let's start with dark matter. Going forward just a little bit, he continues to drive, and then they get to an abandoned building. Jason, is knocked out at some point, and so we start here. When I come to, his abductor, is dragging me out of the front seat by my arms. He drops me in the gravel, where I sit dazed, waiting for my head to clear. It's always colder near the lake, and tonight is no exception. The wind inflicts a raw, serrated bite on my exposed skin, which is covered in goose flesh. It's so dark out here I can see 5 times the number of stars as in the city. My head is throbbing, and a fresh line of blood runs down the side of my face, but with a full load of adrenaline shotgunning through my system, the pain is muted. He drops a flashlight in the dirt beside me and shines his at the disintegrating edifice I saw as we drove in. After you. I clutch the light in my hand and struggle to my feet. Stumbling toward the building, my bare feet trample sodden newspaper. I dodge crumpled beer cans and chevrons of glass that glitter under the beam. Approaching the main entrance, I imagine this abandoned parking lot on another night, a night to come. It's early winter, and through a curtain of falling snow, the darkness is ribboned with flashing blues and reds. Detectives and cadaver dogs swarm the ruins, and as they examine my body somewhere inside, naked and decomposed and butchered, a patrol car parks in front of my brownstone in Logan Square. It's 2 a.m. Daniela comes out, etc., etc. So he's imagining this, but we are seeing this place through his internal monologue. And again, it's amping up the tension higher and higher. I mean, he's already questioned whether or not he's going to live. And now he's right on the edge of that, right? He thinks he's being led into this building to be cut up, beat up, butchered, chopped into pieces by his abductor, who he still doesn't know what he wants. And so this is a great example of setting being used to show emotional state. You just want to find ways to do this over and over again, in different ways, of course, for applicable to your own story. In The Hobbit, they travel on a little bit with the dwarves, Bilbo does. Gandalf has left the party momentarily, and they are in the woods, and they come across a fire in the distance, and they don't know what it is yet, and they elect Bilbo to go and check it out because he's their burglar. So it begins, that settled it. After all, we have got a burglar with us, they said, and so they made off, leading their ponies with all due and proper caution in the direction of the light. They came to the hill and were soon in the wood. Up the hill they went, but there was no proper path to be seen, such as might lead to a house or a farm, and do what they could. They made a deal of rustling and crackling and creaking, and a good deal of grumbling and dratting, as they went through the trees in the pitch dark. Suddenly the red light shone out very bright through the tree trunks not far ahead. Now it's the burglar's turn, they said, meaning Bilbo. You must go on and find out about the light. Then jumping forward, off Bilbo had to go before he could explain that he could not hoot even once like any kind of owl, any more than fly like a bat. But at any rate, hobbits can move quietly in the woods, absolutely quietly. They take pride in it. And so he moves quietly through the forest, and he comes upon 3 very large persons sitting around a very large fire of beech logs. They were roasting mutton on long spits of wood and licking the gravy off their fingers. There was a fine toothsome smell. Also, there was a barrel of good drink at hand, and they were drinking out of jugs. But they were trolls. Obviously trolls. Even Bilbo, in spite of his sheltered life, could see that from the great heavy faces of them and their size and the shape of their legs, not to mention their language, which was not drawing room fashion at all, at all. Mutton yesterday, mutton today, and blimey if it don't look like mutton again tomorrow, said one of the trolls. So here, this is a very interesting mix that Tolkien drew. Bilbo is a little bit scared. He's off on this adventure, and he's not really an adventurer yet. He has Tookish blood, and so it implies that he has an adventurous streak in him, and that's partly why he agreed to come on this adventure. But now that it's come to it, you can kind of tell he's a little bit timid. But at the same time, there's pride, right? Tolkien says it outright that hobbits take pride moving quietly through the woods, and then he does as well, right? So he's good at it. And so there's this mixture of nervousness, timidness, and pride and curiosity as he goes towards the trolls. So again, setting is being used as a window, as a launch pad toward character emotion. And then moving to the heroes, we're in Calder's point of view at this point. And so Calder is a royal figure who's being called into this council before this looming battle begins. It opens like this. The stable doors shut with a bang like a headsman's axe. And it took all of Calder's famous arrogance not to jump clean in the air. War meetings had never been his favorite style of gathering, especially one full of his enemies. 3 of Dow's 5 war chiefs were in attendance, and, as Calder's ever-worsening luck would have it, they were the 3 that liked him least. Glama Golden looked the hero from his scalp to his toes, big knuckle, brawny, and heavy jaw handsome, his long hair, his bristling mustache, his eyelashes to their tips, all the color of pale gold. So we describe Glama Golden. Cairn Ironhead was a very different prospect. His scar-crossed face was a fortress of frown you could have blunted an axe on, eyes like nails under a brow like an anvil, cropped hair and beard, and uncompromising black. He was shorter than Golden. Next paragraph. When it came to hatred, Broad Tenways had a bottomless supply. He was one of those bastards who can't even breathe quietly, ugly as incest, and always delighted to push it in your face, leering from the shadows, like the village pervert at a passing milkmaid. In this case, we're going through the members of this council, so we know who's there. And so one of the rules that we're going to talk about in just a second is making sure that you get everything that's going to be in the scene, everything important up front, so that you avoid the mistake of having something show up later that kind of pops into the reader's head. That's disjointing for the reader. It's confusing. And so you do want to front load your setting. And here, this is really heavy in setting, unlike his first chapter that we saw from Craw. But it's important, A, to get those characters in place in the reader's mind before this scene really begins. But B, Abercrombie is doing it in such a way that he describes their hatred of him first, and so it raises the emotional stakes. Here, we're launching from emotion and his past, so description a little bit describing the people, but also setting because we're describing them within this stables. Again, you can pause this if you want to read it. We go on and we get all the different members of this council before we really dive in to the scene. So in all 3 cases, the author is tying the setting somehow to the characters in such a way that you learn more about the characters themselves. The way you describe setting can shed light on a character's mindset. So think about how the POV character and others might react to the setting. Think about that scene with Gorst pushing the wagon out, and other people are reacting too. They might be in bad moods, or the POV character might. And so you can use that as a way to shed light on how they think about it. Have them interact or comment with the setting in such a way that it reflects their personality, their current mindset, maybe even their goals for the current scene or beyond. Now let's talk about setting as a doorway to world. And so I'm going to go through 3 more examples. So Craw describing the valley that the heroes, which is again a henge, and it's the site of this battle, this brewing battle. And then Bilbo thinking they'd reached the Lonely Mountain when they were still weeks away. Finally, Jason returning home and finding it's not really his. So here in the heroes, it's the next chapter. We're back in Craw's point of view. It opens, beautiful, ain't it? So it's somebody talking about the setting. Beautiful, ain't it? Said Agric, big grin across his freckled face. Is it? Muttered Craw. He'd been thinking about the ground and how he might use it, and how an enemy might do the same. An old habit. It had been the better half of Bethod's talk when they were on campaign. The ground and how to make a weapon of it. So Craw's an old hand at this. He's a veteran, right? And he's thinking about how they're going to manage the coming battle. The hill the hero stood on was ground an idiot could have seen the value of. It sprouted alone from the flat valleys, so much alone and so oddly smooth a shape it seemed almost a thing man-made. 2 spurs welled from it, one pushing west with a single needle of rock raised up on one end, which folk had named Scarling's Finger. One to the southeast, a ring of smaller stones. On top, they called the children. Okay, so more description. This is a detailed description now, finally, of not just the heroes, the henge, but everything around it. This is an important place, and this is, I wouldn't call this a set piece exactly, but at some point Abercrombie had to describe the greater setting in a lot more detail, but he's doing it by having this interesting, kind of funny interaction between Agric and Craw. So he goes on to describe the far side of the river. Everything looked normal. We see at the bottom of the second paragraph on the right-hand side, nothing to remark upon, and no sign whatever of the Union or Hardbred or any of the Dogman's boys. Hard to believe there was any war at all. There is a larger war going on, and this site, the heroes, is the expected site of a coming battle that will decide the war once and for all. So then some internal monologue again, and then at the bottom of the page, "Beautiful," said Agric again. "Everything looks prettier in the sun," said Craw. "If it was raining, you'd be calling it the ugliest valley in the world. Maybe." Agric closed his eyes and tipped his face back. "But it ain't raining." And so here we're getting a bit of exposition. We know a little bit more about Craw. This is giving a hint of the coming battle. There is peace in the valley right now, which implies a calm before the storm. So Abercrombie is setting the stage for this looming battle that's coming in an effective way, but a quiet way, in fact, at this point in the story. So moving to Dark Matter, Jason has moved from his reality to another reality. He's been shoved through by his abductor himself from another reality. They've kind of traded places. He's in a different place. And again, this is leaning into this notion of, what if I had done something different? He is now in the world where the Jason he thought he could have been and kind of pines after, that's where he lived. And so he's kind of about to experience that Jason's life and see what it was like. So it's like, will you come to regret that if you did go back in time? You know, that's sort of the idea of this book. So we come to chapter 3. He is now in that other world, and he's heading home. He's freaked out, and he doesn't quite know what's going on yet. And so I hurry across the street and up the steps, pulling keys out of my pocket that aren't my keys. As I try to find the one that fits the lock, I realize this isn't my door. Well, it is my door. It's my street, my number on the mailbox, but the handle isn't right. The wood is too elegant, and the hinges are these iron Gothic-looking things more suited to a medieval tavern. I turn the deadbolt. The door swings inward. Something is wrong. Very, very wrong. I step across the threshold into the dining room. This doesn't smell like my house. It doesn't smell like anything but the faintest odor of dust, like no one has lived here in quite some time. The lights are out. And not just some of them, every last one. I close the door and fumble in the darkness until my hand grazes a dimmer switch. A chandelier made of antlers warms the room above a minimalist glass table that isn't mine and chairs that aren't mine. I call out, "Hello?" The house is so quiet, revoltingly quiet, implying that he's so used to his family and having noise around the house, right? It's kind of showing a contrast between his old life and this other Jason's current life. In my home, on the mantel behind the dining room table, there's a large candid photograph of Daniela, Charlie, and me standing at Inspiration Point in Yellowstone National Park. In this house, there's a deep contrast black and white photograph of the same canyon, more artfully done, but with no one in it. Really, really cool way to show the differences between the current Jason and other Jason. They have kind of the same interests, right? So they might both have gone to Yellowstone National Park, but current Jason has a family and other Jason does not. And it's just a really cool way to show it, but also a way to start showing the weirdness of what's going on. Blake Crouch is dropping little clues about what's going on. And of course you're picking up that this is a similar place and a similar life to Jason, but you don't know what happened yet or how he got there or how he's going to get back, that type of thing. Just a really interesting way to pull the reader along through the story while giving hints about what happened along the way. And then in The Hobbit, we get to chapter 3. And so they've moved past the troll scene at this point, and it begins. They did not sing or tell stories that day, even though the weather improved, nor the next day, nor the day after. They had begun to feel that danger was not far away on either side. They camped under the stars, and their horses had more to eat than they had, for there was plenty of grass, but there was not much in their bags, even with what they had got from the trolls. It goes on. They ford a river, and they see a mountain in the distance. And Bilbo says, "Is that the mountain, the lonely mountain that they're heading towards?" So he says it in a solemn voice, looking at it with round eyes. He had never seen a thing that looked so big before. So it kind of implies what the Shire is like, where Hobbiton is, that has hills but no mountains. "Of course not," said Balin. "That is only the beginning of the Misty Mountains, and we have got to get through, or over, or under those somehow before we can come into Wilderland beyond. And it is a deal of way even from the other side of them to the Lonely Mountain in the east where Smaug lies on our treasure." "Oh," said Bilbo. And just at that moment he felt more tired than he ever remembered feeling before. He was thinking once again of his comfortable chair before the fire in his favorite sitting room in his hobbit hole, and the kettle singing, not for the last time. Tolkien is using their journey as a way to think about how far they've come. He does this in The Lord of the Rings as well with Frodo. In this case, Bilbo is moving farther away from comfort and safety, familiarity in the Shire, and moving closer and closer to something dangerous in the Lonely Mountain. And this is like a mile marker along the way. We see Bilbo feeling tired than he ever remembered feeling before. Tired, but also you get the sense of like, I don't like this anymore. There's an anxiousness in him. He's not scared exactly. We don't get that sense, but we do get the sense that he would like nothing better to have not gone on this journey at all at this point. But it also shows us that we've come a certain way, so we're marking how far we've moved throughout the world, and we're marking how far we have yet to go. We have to get across the Misty Mountain somehow. We have to go through the Wilderland, through the woods, and get to the Lonely Mountain eventually. And only then does Bilbo's job truly begin as a burglar. And so in all three of those cases, we are seeing a bit of the larger world. In the case of Crow, we're getting a better description of this important valley. In the case of Bilbo, we're seeing how far we've gone, how far we have yet to go, and getting an idea of the lay of the land along the way. And in Jason, he's coming to another place that's like his home, but different. And so the world in this case is the multiverse in Blake Crouch's story. And so even though Jason is returning to a place that he sort of knows, it's not. And so we're getting a sense of what this world is like. So setting is allowing us to explore world in greater detail. So this is something you want to keep in mind as you're not just choosing your setting, but as you're laying it out in the writing itself and editing it later on. It's a key skill to develop to show your world as it is and trust that the reader will pick up clues as to its nature. Again, we can't describe everything, right? You are picking and choosing what to show that has maximum impact in terms of showing the character, world, and plot. So that trust that you have with the reader, that you're just giving clues and letting them pick things up, that's part of the joy of reading. And that trust that you place in them pays dividends later on. The reader may be slightly off balance at first, but that's part of the fun, and that gets them invested as you start following through on some of those implied promises. Like, I will tell you what's going on, just not yet. Stay with me. You can push that kind of thing too far and not give the reader enough, and they just get confused for too long that they give up on the story. But as long as you're following through on some of those promises while posing new questions, they are there for the ride. They are glued to that story. And so this is part of that. This is part of keeping readers glued to the page, the setting. And so by doing that, the world itself feels more like a living, breathing place that goes beyond the scenes and the characters that we see and interact with in the story. Then let me touch on one more thing, the third point in that triangle I mentioned earlier of world, character, and plot. So setting as a doorway to plot. In The Hobbit, we're shown Smaug's jewel-encrusted belly, which is a precursor to Bard, a character, later killing the dragon through a gap in the armor Bilbo saw while he was down in Smaug's lair. In Dark Matter, Jason goes to other Jason's home, as we saw, and finds clues about what's happened to him. In The Heroes, Craw's sizing up the valley relates directly to the later battle. In all three cases, setting is being tied to plot, even if the reader doesn't realize it yet. So let's talk about setting versus description and action. Setting, I suppose, strictly speaking, describes the world that you're setting the scene in, so the physical place. Here, I'm using description to refer to how the characters and maybe like animals, beasts, what have you, and objects look, and action is the movement of those things within the setting. And so you're going to weave between all three of those things as the scene progresses. You're going to be constantly touching on setting, description, and action. So in order to show you this, let me go back to the heroes and that war council that we touched on just a little bit ago. I'm going to be sweeping through this a little bit fast and just pulling some things out here and there. And so right after we have the description of who's there, then we start getting into the dialogue and the interaction between the characters. And so right down here we have, well, if it ain't brave Prince Calder. Dow looked him up and down like a tomcat at the shrub it was about to piss on. A little bit of description, right? Dow looked him up and down, and it reminds you that Dow is right there, right? And so is Calder. And he's staring at him a certain way, like a tomcat at the shrub it's about to piss on. Very next paragraph, Calder swept out a bough. And so we see him doing that. And think about how you react to it, right? Calder swept a bough. We're seeing him in the stables that's been described in some detail with these other people. And we see that happening, but it refreshes the scene in our minds. This is one flash of that strobe light that I mentioned. And we're going to just keep doing that over and over again as the scene progresses. Sometimes to a higher degree, sometimes to a lesser degree. But this is the idea. Moving down a little bit. Is it the thing with all the swords? Calder took a hopeful look around the stable. So he took a look around the stable. Again, this is just one little phrase, right, that reminds us they're in a stable. We see him looking around, but it also refreshes our view of the stable itself that, again, has been described in detail. So he sees he has no allies have crept inside to help him, and he ends up glancing at Shiver's ruined frown. It reminds us what Shivers is like. We're not just trying to refresh the setting, we're also trying to refresh the description of characters, because that keeps them vivid as well. Okay, so Shiver's ruined frown, which was even worse than Dow's smile. So we're just touching on Shiver again, and Dow a little bit. Golden snorted down below, a little bit of sound, but we get some character from Golden along the way. Right at the bottom, Calder slapped the hilt of his sword. A little bit of description of physical beat. Next one down, Tenways sneered, stretching his neck out to spit again. He spit before, he spit again. We get another refresher on what this character is like. This paragraph is interesting. So there's some rapid back and forth, and then Dow burst out laughing. Golden chuckled. Ironhead gave the faintest of grins. Tenways choked on his spit and left a string of glistening drool down his chin, but Calder didn't much care. We're going through each of those characters in super rapid fashion, giving them a little bit of physical action, but also reminding the reader who's there. Sometimes you have a lot of characters in your scenes, and it is hard to keep them all involved without boring the reader. Not confusing the reader with too many characters, but also not boring them by having too much detail. Abercrombie is super efficient here in reminding you who's there and what they're like along the way. It's actually quite a concise scene that is quite vivid in the reader's mind as you go through it. And that's what I want you to take away from this, is being able to just drop in tiny little bits of description, characters interacting with the setting, so that it keeps that scene alive. That strobe light keeps flashing while the action, dialogue, etc. is playing out. Just a couple more things. So down here, Dow took the pommel of his sword between finger and thumb, turning it this way and that, and it glints. So we just have a thing being shown. It's not setting per se, but it reminds us who's there. Just a few paragraphs later, Golden, this Croy, sneered Golden back across the stable. Abercrombie's just moving between action, setting, and description of objects and things over and over again throughout the scene in really quick, really tiny ways that keeps it fresh. I mentioned this before, but you see examples along the way of using all the senses. Evoking multiple senses goes a long way to making the scene come alive. The rule of thumb is to have 3 of the 5 regular senses being used in every single scene, and especially in your opening. You really want to hit those quickly and in interesting, unique ways, vivid ways, to pull the reader into the story. So sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch are the main 5, of course, but we do have other senses as well. You should look these up and become more familiar with them and use them here and there. So things like our sense of balance. That is not one of the main 5. Kinesthetic sense, being able to sense where your body is without actually seeing it. Temporal, time, passage. Temperature, pressure, sense of pain, and more. Look those up, have those in your arsenal, your writer's toolbox, so that you can use them at different times. Use them to your advantage. Again, use 3 senses at least early-ish on in every scene just to pull the reader in and give them a sense of the new time and place that they are. I mentioned physical beats, so you can replace dialogue tags with little bits of action, and we saw that in Abercrombie's especially, all of them really, but so these are referred to as physical beats, just a little description of physical action, and that allows us to not use a dialogue tag in that case. So we're not like overloading our copy, our manuscript with he said, she said constantly. And it also doubles as one little flash of that strobe light, right? So use physical beats to alleviate that need of using dialogue tags all over the place. One place setting is less commonly used, but it is useful in certain circumstances, is putting setting into dialogue and internal monologue. You can reinforce setting through people talking about it or a character thinking about it in some way. It's probably not something you'll use every single scene, but it is there for you. It can come in handy to help keep the scene alive and to give the characters a chance to interact with the setting in a different way, either by using that character noting something about the setting to launch into internal monologue, perhaps having the characters argue about something that is in the setting around them, or at least talk about it. That will help keep the scene around them alive as well. So let me show you an example from Dark Matter. Right after Jason gets to his home that isn't his home, he's moving through it. He's trying to figure out what's going on. And so we see this section on the right in yellow. I step into the next room on the left, my son's room, except it's not. There's none of his surrealist artwork, no bed, no manga posters, no desk with homework strewn across it, no lava lamps, no backpack, no clothes scattered all over the floor. And so he's actually noting what's not there. You get a sense of what this room is like, that it's maybe spare, maybe it's empty. We're not even sure just yet. But we do note that it doesn't have the things that Jason expects to be there. And so this is saying a lot about Jason himself, right? And the things that he cares about, notes, in his son's life that is a big part of his own life. This bit of interior monologue is actually being used to describe both the current room in front of him and his son's room back in his old universe, the one he left not long ago. So then jumping forward a few pages, Jason goes to a hospital because he thinks he's having some kind of psychotic breakdown. And in the yellow here, the nurse, the receptionist, I think, that is checking him in says, "You have cuts all over your face." So he's been through some things by this point. "I'm not well," I say. "What do you mean?" And so that "you have cuts all over your face," that gives us a bit of its description, kind of. It's just Jason himself, not the setting around him exactly, but you get the idea. You can use dialogue to comment on setting. And so keep that in your back pocket. You want to use the setting to go beyond place. Setting details should describe more than mere physicality. It should also convey things like the tone, the mood, the emotion of this scene in this character, this POV character's mind. It can convey humor or seriousness or dread. It can sometimes contrast between character mood and the environment. In the valley in The Heroes, where Craw is looking over it, Agric comments on how beautiful it is, but in Craw's mind, he's just being very analytical about it. He's not thinking about beauty at all. He's thinking about how to survive and to win this coming battle. And so you can use that to contrast between the character's mood and maybe even multiple characters' moods, which Abercrombie did in that case. I mentioned early on that we want to choose which setting we use for each scene for maximum effect. Where you choose to set your scenes is an important decision. A carefully chosen setting can help convey history of the world, vibrancy in it, culture, religion, oppression, or freedom. Keep in mind, every new setting places a burden on the story. The reader has to read through more stuff, and really what they care about is the character trying to reach their goals. That's in the end what they really care about, readers. And so as you add on new settings, if you add a new one every single time, it can become burdensome for the reader. So it's a balancing act. You want to kind of pick and choose your battles with care. Using existing settings is a lot more efficient, right? If you're going back to the same place, you can count on the reader remembering that stuff and you don't have to fill in all those details. And so the scene kind of starts and gets into the meat of it faster. But the overuse of any one setting can lead to monotony too. So the reader can feel that as well. So in the end, choose your settings with care. This is one of those dark magic, black arts that is difficult to convey and it's hard to learn as you move along, but just keep thinking about it, be mindful of it, and do your best as your story is moving along to choose the setting that will work the best for any given scene. So think about recently used settings. What has come before? What settings will you be using up ahead? Do you have some decided already? That may help navigate. Settings in your world that can provide the most emotional impact. In this case, in Dark Matter, Blake Crouch had Jason go back to his house. I mean, that's really impactful, right? Or settings that will help illuminate what the world is like. Use all of those things to help you navigate and choose the right setting. So let's talk about some tips and some pitfalls. Again, we do want to front load the key details of a scene. Failing to do so makes some things pop into existence. And so when we think about that war council, Abercrombie knew he had to introduce all the characters, but he did it in such a way that it was important, impactful, emotional to Calder, the main character. Settings need to do more than just describe the world. Find inventive ways to avoid static description. Make it reveal character and world and tie it to plot as well. Remember that in writing, less is often more. Use the setting to imply a lot more than the physical place. Trust the reader to fill in the rest. Also, use the setting as a vehicle for character commentary, either internal monologue or external dialogue. Alleviate the need for dialogue tags, as we mentioned, by adding bits of action, those physical beats. Have characters interact with the setting. Remember, performs double duty. It implies who's speaking, so you can get rid of those dialogue tags in those paragraphs, perhaps, while also refreshing the setting, that strobe effect. We're constantly looking to do that as the scene moves along. And where it makes sense, add setting details to dialogue and internal monologue. And then some pitfalls. Don't give the reader too much detail. Remember, the action slows or stops altogether as we describe the setting, especially in that static type of description. Not giving the reader enough detail. You want to be mindful of this. This can lead to the dreaded talking head syndrome, where the reader doesn't really get a sense of where they are. And so you're missing an opportunity in that case to make the story itself feel more real to the reader. On a related note, in reviewing scenes, look for things that pop into existence. If you find some of those that really should have been up front, the character should know about it, go ahead and incorporate those things into the initial setting. And it doesn't have to be long. You don't have to go into a great amount of detail because you might go into more detail later. Somebody at the back of the room who somebody can barely see becomes important to the scene later on, and then you can describe them in more detail, for example. Dialogue, though related to sound, isn't actually a replacement for sound. So we want to keep in mind to add multiple senses to each of our scenes. So make sure you're adding explicit sounds along with other senses as well. Adding static setting description without justification, again, can bore the reader. So there are times and places for static descriptions, these set pieces that I mentioned. Maybe if you're writing something that is kind of a travelogue style story where it is important to the reader, to you and the reader, to explore the world more. And so you might do it in that case. If you do have one of those set pieces, you want to make sure that they're justified, that you hint at them along the way. You make the reader want them before you give it to them, and then they become that much more interested in reading that passage when they get to it. Finally, I'll close with this. Analyze your favorite author's settings. Go through several scenes from your favorite authors line by line. Highlight the initial setting when it first crops up. Highlight areas where they refresh the setting in some way through physical beats or longer passages as the scene progresses. Note how they bring character, thoughts, and emotions into the setting, or use that as like a springboard to talk about their current mindset, the character's mindset. Also note how they illuminate the larger world through setting. They describe some things that imply a whole bunch of other stuff. Just take note of that. See what lessons you can learn from their example. Incorporating setting into your stories is deceptively complex. It's pretty tricky, but it's a key skill to develop as a writer. I hope this video helped to illuminate some of the things to think about when choosing settings, and also while you're describing the setting itself, up front and in the middle of a scene, to keep it alive. As always, if you found this talk useful, I hope you'll like and share with other writers and writer groups. I have a ton of videos I hope to tackle soon, including a new video on the hidden features of Scrivener, a deep dive analysis of a chase scene, and more. So be sure to mash that subscribe button so you don't miss a thing. I hope to see you in the next one. Until then, dream big, stay positive, and keep writing. Peace, everyone.